Hello, everyone, and welcome. Lovely to see you all. Fantastic that you could all join us on this bank holiday weekend for this meeting. If you've joined us before, you know that this has been a series of fantastic meetings we've been having since the lockdown. If this is your first time, you've picked a great meeting to join to. This meeting today is titled COVID Crisis and the Resistance in the Global South. Really exciting stuff. My name is Elizabeth Adofo. I'm a Socialist Worker Party member from South London, and today I will be chairing this meeting. For this meeting, we've got three fantastic speakers for you today from all across the globe. We've got Hamza Hamouchene, who is a London-based Algerian activist and journalist. He's the founding member of the Algerian Solidarity Campaign, and he currently works in the Transnational Institute. We also have Gyekye Tanoh, who is part of our sister organization based in Ghana, and he also works with the Hand and Brain Collective. And we have Talat Ahmed, who is the senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and is also the author of Mahatma Gandhi's Experiments on Civil Disobedience. So three fantastic speakers for you today. We hope that you will really enjoy this meeting. We want this meeting to be interactive. We want to hear your thoughts. Our panel later on in the meeting will be able to answer some questions. So please make sure that you are sharing, you're liking, and you're getting your comments and questions through, and hopefully we can answer some of those. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Gyekye. And like I said, he's speaking to us all the way from Ghana, as he's part of our sister organization over there, and he also works in the Hand and Brain Collective. So I'll take it over to you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair Elizabeth, and to the Socialist Workers Party comrades who are organizing this. I think it's obviously an important time to share ideas about what is happening in the midst of a global crisis which has various dimensions, but the most immediate is, of course, the public health emergency in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, as is in the nature of the global system, things happen on a very uneven level. And so when we look at the incidence of the virus and the rate of infection, the rate of deaths, we see that at the moment, the OECD countries, the countries of the global north, are those who have taken the biggest hits in terms of infections and in terms of deaths. And so I think more than 75% of of infections and of deaths have happened in the global north, and another 10 or 15% in countries like China, Iran, and so on. And the majority of the global south, 60 or more countries, they account for about 3 or 4% of the levels of incidence and deaths so far. And in the case of Africa, of course, we are well behind the curve, probably furthest behind, whatever that means. But clearly, in terms of the infection and the death rate, so far we have not been at the center of the storm. And of course, many of you will be aware that it has led many commentators to give a very benign, spin on what is happening. On the one hand, the weather in Africa is too hot. The population is very young. The median population of Africa is only 19 years old. There are very few old people. Less than 3% of the entire population are above 75 or 80. A whole range. It is disconnected, especially the rural parts of Africa are disconnected from the global traffic and so on and so forth. And a whole range of different factors, and including some which sound fairly positive. For example, the case has been made that the lessons that have been learned in the process of dealing with previous epidemics, most recently the Ebola epidemic that broke out in West Africa from 2013 to 2016 is a case in point. As we speak, there are ongoing epidemics of various kinds, including, once again, Ebola in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa, but also things like, Lassa fever in Nigeria, cerebrospinal meningitis in Ghana, and so on and so forth, many of which are killing more people than the COVID-19, the coronavirus itself. So for that reason, I think that there are those who are hoping that this, Africa may miss the worst, of this, and that for the first time in a long time, we will not be the source of the greatest tragedy or the source of the greatest crisis in a global, in this kind of global context. Already there were people in Africa who were, if you like, somewhat relieved that unlike Ebola and so on, this time, the problem didn't break out in Africa. We are not the ones spreading the disease. And yet somehow we face the fact that in places like China and other parts of the world, the anti-Black racism has followed hot on the heels of anti-Chinese racism and so on. the whole, xenophobic racist trend, we have been at the butt of that as well. As recently as, so as we speak today, there's only about 74, well, not only, the 75, just shy of 75,000 infections in Africa. The World Health Organization released a report, I think it was early May 7th or so, which projected that in the first year of the pandemic, there might still be 190,000 people who die from it in Africa. Now, that will be, anywhere in the world, that would be a huge thing. In Africa, it will be utterly devastating, because obviously we understand, all of us would understand quite clearly, that the impact of the coronavirus pandemic intersects with the conditions that capitalism continues to reproduce and perpetrates in different parts of the world on an uneven basis. So the poverty in Africa, as the poorest part of the poorest region in the world, that poverty is expressed in terms of health systems, for example. So how Africa has the lowest per capita public expenditure on health per head. I think it's about, at the moment, it's about what would be the equivalent of 31 pounds sterling per year. If you guys went on lockdown and you went to the pub, I think you managed to spend 31 pounds in a few short minutes. That is per head per year. There's only about three or four doctors to 1,000 to 10,000 population. There's very few emergency beds and so on and so forth. And as we saw in the case of Ebola, anytime that there's a pandemic of this sort, every time that there's a public health emergency of this sort, it has a knock-on effect throughout the health system, no matter the incidence of the direct transmissions, no matter the incidence of directly related deaths, and so on. So in the case of Ebola, for example, we found a complete collapse in maternal health care across not just the 3 countries that were affected, but further afield in West Africa. In places like Ghana, you are beginning to see that hospital attendance rates are much lower than they used to be, not only because of the lockdown or conditions that people may fear, being infected in hospitals and so on, but it's also because of the fact that the healthcare system itself is beginning to pass on costs that onto people. The amounts of supply of critical drugs, for example, HIV and antiretroviral drugs, a lot of people are not getting it anymore. A lot of people are forced to pay for things that they were not previously paying for, and so on. And of course, we find that this is a situation which speaks not simply to the crisis of the fact that these are poor countries with small budgets and so on, but it speaks to the policy framework that exists in these countries. These countries too are part of neoliberal capitalism. They are part of the fact that the system exists to promote the sectors of the economy and the types of economic activity that maximizes profit and cuts back on those sectors that do not generate immediate profit. Healthcare, many parts of aspects of healthcare are one case in point. And whenever you find a crisis that is unfolding on this scale, you find that is one of the first consequences of those crises, the cutbacks in these crises. But it's important to situate, as I was saying, this in the context of capitalism as it operates, as it functions in Africa itself. We all know, for example, that prior to the crisis, one of the manifestations of the crisis has been the collapse of strategic prices of strategic commodities in the international market, such as oil. Now, obviously, that started before the pandemic because of the price issues between Saudi Arabia, Russia, so on and so forth. People know about it. We don't need to get into it. But in a continent like Africa, which is so highly dependent on raw material exports as its lifeline, as its main contribution to the international economy, this means that the effects of the economic effects are devastating already. A country like Nigeria, which is Africa's biggest economy, is projected to have a GDP decline of 23% or 24% this year. Africa as a whole is supposed to go into the African growth rate will decline to about minus 1.6%. This is the lowest rate ever on record. Since February, there has been levels of capital flight from Africa higher in terms of ratio than any continent in the world, and is the highest kind of outflow on record as well. So if you add the terms of trade shock from the collapse of commodity prices, you add the flight of capital to safe havens and to the dollar and so on and so forth, then you find that this unevenness, this which concentrates poverty and underdevelopment in parts of the world, means that the problems that everybody faces in the world are more deeply exacerbated in places like Africa as well. And therefore, it also means that in situating the COVID-19 crisis in the broader context of economic relations, of who gets what, who decides what is produced, on what basis, who are the beneficiaries, who are the losers, and so on and so forth. It's important that we also understand that in going forward, a lot of the crises that I've just touched upon will become exacerbated. African countries will have to export more and more primary commodities to make up for the collapse in prices. That's one. That means more environmental degradation. That means that more of the problems that people have in terms of the the environmental contamination, which is part of the process of pandemic viruses like the corona virus taking root, will become exacerbated. Whether it's respiratory diseases in North Africa, whether it's problems associated with HIV in Southern Africa, and so on. Whether it's the problems of the crossover between animal and infested bat populations, as we saw in the case of Ebola, because of deforestation right across from Central Africa into West Africa and so on. You will find an intensification of these type of relations, an intensification of that type of production for profit. It will also mean an intensification of the efforts and the incentives that are given to the global ruling class to attract capital back into Africa. All the capital that has gone out, there has to be a way to find that that is attracted back. So African countries, despite their complaints about being in debt, and despite their partial requests for partial debt relief and so on and so forth, are also eager not to lose access to international capital. They are also eager not to lose access to the international financial markets. And that is really their priority. They will bend over backwards to ensure that this access is protected, even if it means imposing higher costs on their population, even if it means that they're disinvesting in jobs in sectors such as electricity, in health, in water, and so on. So that when we look at the sweep of this global unevenness, it is very easy for people to interpret that unevenness simply as a mark of racism, as I've said. It is very easy to see it simply from the lens of global South versus global North. After all, even when it comes to what is required to treat this particular health crisis, whether it is PPEs for frontline health staff, whether it is masks, whichever way, whether it is reagents for testing, whichever way it is, the countries of the global North are monopolizing those markets, they're monopolizing the supplies, and so on. So it is very easy for people to see it in a North-South situation. But I think it's important to understand also that we're dealing with a system because of the interlinkages involved, because of the dependency of African ruling classes themselves on those global circuits of profits, and the ways in which they participate in the exploitation of labor in Africa, along with in partnership with the global capital and so on. It's important to see why the processes of this natural resource exploitation, the process of the intensification of labor exploitation, the exploitation of human beings, the process of exploitation of women's labor, for example, those who will bear the brunt of the social reproduction crisis, the crisis in healthcare delivery, and so on and so forth. It's important to see how all these things play out. And in Africa, we've had a challenge. The challenge has been that you have, just like most of the global South, you have a situation where in a lot of places, those who have a classical image of the working class as people who go to work 8 to 5 or whatever it is and so on and so forth, doesn't necessarily always fit. We have what is called this whole huge informal sector. And there are many debates about what this informal sector means. A lot of people think that it's simply a haven for self-employment and so on and so forth. There are a lot of people who dismiss that entirely, that actually it's a mask for something else. And that people who are in the informal sector are also very much at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to their participation in the distribution of, let's say, global supply chains. In the case of retail, for example, the millions of youth who crowd the streets in Africa who are selling everything from dog chains to condoms to false medicine to pharmaceutical products to mobile phone parts are also therefore delivering distribution services for those global brands and those global multinationals which actually produce those commodities themselves. But without the benefit of a full-time job, without the benefit of pay, health benefits, pensions, social security payments, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that the spectrum of those through which surplus value is being pumped in their various activities in the economy itself, whether it's in the natural resource production sector, whether it's in the services sector, like I've just described, trade, telecommunications, and so on, retail trade, and so on. It's important to understand that the evolution of the working class in Africa poses a problem, a challenge for socialists wherever we are. It poses a challenge for those whose primary objective in terms of resistance and in terms of transformation, in terms of alternatives to the system, is to promote the unity of the working class as a whole, and to put the project of the united working class first and foremost, rather than that of any one of its sections. When you're confronted with a situation where the formal working class is as small as it is in Africa, a lot of people, would rather bend to different types of populisms or make arguments about a particular exceptionalism that applies to this situation. I don't think that, hopefully in the discussion, we can pick some of those things. I don't think that actually those things are fully true. And the reason why they're not fully true is this is the point I want to end on. They're not fully true because when you look at the pattern of resistance that has occurred in the context of COVID-19, and there has been health workers going on strike, whether it's in Malawi for PPEs, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in, teachers resisting in Ghana. 3 teachers unions, education sector unions have come together to resist the government's attempt to open schools very quickly, and so on and so forth. Many of the struggles that you see everywhere in the world have also occurred in a widespread way in Africa. But it has also occurred in the communities that were being locked down as a result of, and are suffering as a result of deprivation because of the conditions of their livelihood, and so on. But what you find is that the protests that occur in the communities are less organized and have less systemic resonance than those which occur among the organized working class in organized workplaces, and so on. That tells us that we have to find a way to understand how the strategic power of different sections of the working class combine together. We also have to understand the ways in which the certain demands will benefit everybody in the working class. An approach which says that we need community health, but we need to guarantee livelihoods in the community on the basis of, people talk about universal basic income, for example, by which, in our sense, ought to mean a bottom-up process by which everybody is guaranteed livelihood, is guaranteed productive employment, and income assessments based on those productive employments is guaranteed a minimum basket of services in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of transport, in terms of food, and so on and so forth, and that we are able to ensure that the local production of food, the local production of needed essential services, and the local production of different material goods are on the basis of a redistribution from the top of society to the bottom of society. That it depends on workers winning better wages. It depends on farmers getting better incomes. It depends on investments in the process through which the rural production and urban production can mutually sustain and mutually promote each other. And it is only in the context of that that we can begin to actually address some of the challenges that might exist by way of ethnic divisions, by way of divisions according to migrant labor, cross-border labor, which comes in seasonally, but as a moment is shut out or is criminalized because of the lockdowns and the border, the closure of borders and so on and so forth. It's also on that basis that we can have a thoroughly, a thoroughgoing agenda for women's liberation and implant that within the working class in places like Africa. Because in the global South, we also have to say that some of the transitions that have taken place in terms of social rights, in terms of fighting for certain agendas, have not necessarily happened. In Africa, even though there are movements against xenophobia and so on, you do not have full-blown movements against ethnic politics and so on, the way you see anti-racism function in Britain, for example. All the kind of ways in which socialists in Europe embed the question of women's liberation at the center and as an indivisible part of what they do. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do, tied to the material interests that you can unite the working classes as a whole, and tied to the way in which we challenge capital locally and internationally as well. And therefore, a new internationalism is also required for us to fight this process as well. Let me stop here. I think I've probably taken a bit more of my time than I should have, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Gyekye. That was absolutely brilliant. That was such a well-rounded analysis of the situation that's going on in Africa. So thank you very much. I can see that online we've got about 350 people watching us. We want to keep that up. We want to get that more. So please make sure that you are liking and sharing this across to all your friends and across your platforms. We also want this to be a discussion. Our panelists really want to answer some of your questions. So make sure you're submitting your thoughts, your questions, even if you think they could be like really short. Doesn't matter. We want to hear what you guys have to say, so please submit those through. I'd like to bring in our next speaker. I'm going to bring in Hamza Hamouchene, who is the London-based Algerian activist and journalist. He currently works for the Transnational Institute. Hamza, what's your analysis of this situation?
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and thanks for SWP for giving me the opportunity to speak about the Algerian uprising, which has been a truly historic event. My presentation would be a bit different, so I'll start with the genesis of the Algerian uprising. So I prepared a few slides with you just to share a few pictures so people can follow. Yeah. So the people won the first battle in their struggle to radically overhaul the system in early April 2019. Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the alien president for the past 20 years, was forced to abdicate after more than 6 weeks of street protests and a reconfiguration of alliances within the ruling classes. What started as a rejection of the candidacy of a physically unfit octogenarian president has transformed in face of the obstinacy and deceptive ploys of the ruling elites into a united rejection of the ruling system with demands for radical democratic change, freedom, and justice. For more than a year, and since Friday, 22nd February 2019, and despite all obstacles and attempts to break the movement, millions of people, young and old, men and women from different social classes, have taken to the streets in an inspiring uprising, reappropriating long confiscated public space. Historic Friday marches, followed by protests in several sectors, united people in this popular movement, or what Algerians call Hirak. The revolutionary movement in Algeria released the boundless creativity of the popular genius. One chanting, "We woke up and you will pay," the people have been expressing their newly discovered political will. This liberatory process is at the same time a transformational one. And we can witness this in the euphoria, energy, creativity, confidence, humor, and joy that this movement has inspired after decades of social and political suppression. What makes this movement really unique is its massive scale, peaceful character, and national spread, including in the marginalized South. The movement is also characterized by a significant participation of women and young people. One can also see this uprising as the continuation of the anti-colonial struggle of the 50s and 60s. So many references have been made in the various protests and marches to the Algerian anti-colonial revolution and its martyrs, reaffirming that formal independence has no meaning without popular and national sovereignty. These anti-colonial sentiments are reasserted by a staunch hostility to any foreign interference and imperialist intervention, and by an unshakable solidarity with Palestinians in the permanent presence of the Palestinian flag alongside the Algerian one. The Algerian uprising should be analyzed within the second wave of the Arab and African uprisings that started in 2010-2011. In this respect, I think that what's happening in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq can be seen as the continuation of a revolutionary process in North Africa and West Asia, a revolutionary process with ups and downs, gains and setbacks, and with different outcomes in various countries. It is worth noting that students, workers, especially those in the education sector, independent trade unions, judges, and lawyers have been playing a very important role in this mobilization as they participate and organize their own protests, call for strikes, and keep the momentum going. So, what are the political elements that gave rise to this popular movement? The country has been experiencing a political crisis for decades, in particular since the 1992 military coup and the ensuing brutal civil war. The most recent manifestations of this crisis are the direct results of politics of parasitic accumulation and entrenched corruption enforced by a military oligarchic nexus that denies the Algerian people their right to self-determination and dispenses with popular legitimacy to the benefit of domestic and international capital. This crisis has been exacerbated by several factors, not in the least by the alien Bouteflika's general absence from the political stage for the last 6 years, and by intra-elite power struggles, which are symptomatic of the deep-seated contradictions and instability of the current ruling bloc, which has opened up new spaces for resistance. So the decisive entrance of the people onto the political stage in 2019 effectively forced the military high command to distance itself from the presidency and intervene in order to safeguard the regime in place. The Hirak did not come from nowhere. It is the expression of decades of profound pain, anger, and rejection of the repressive authoritarianism, suppression of freedoms, economic and social exclusions, as well as the lack of horizons, especially for the unemployed youth who are still risking their lives to reach the northern shores of the Mediterranean. It is also important to say that the eruption of this popular anger is the result of an accumulation of struggles and acts of resistance that date back to the 80s, the most recent examples being the resident medical doctors' protests in 2018 and the anti-fracking uprisings of 2015. The uprising came at a time of an acute economic crisis characterized by crippling austerity measures following the decline of oil and gas export revenues since 2015-2016. So in the midst of increasing popularization, unemployment, and even development, corruption, the rationality of the current revolt and rebellion becomes absolutely clear. In my view, the causes of the revolt are fundamentally economic and are the results of more than 3 decades of neoliberal restructuring, the Bouteflika era being the most ultra-liberal in Algeria's history. We cannot also fully appreciate the political situation in Algeria without scrutinizing foreign influences and interferences and apprehending the economic question from the angle of natural resource grabs and energy neocolonialism. This includes the enormous concessions made to multinationals and the pressures coming from outside to exercise further liberalizations in order to remove all the restrictions to international capital and fully integrate Algeria into the global economy in a totally subordinate position. Throughout the last year, we've seen a radical evolution of slogans and demands. Within 3 months of the uprisings, what started as a narrow rejection of the fifth term transformed into "they must all go," and to the chants, "we want a civilian, not a military state. Algeria is a republic, not a military barrack." The military high command attempted to divide, exhaust, and suffocate the movement, mobilizing its media outlets and online propaganda and manipulation, and continuing to use repressive methods towards protesters, including physical violence, arrests, and imprisonment. By mid-October, the numbers of the street regained the levels of March and April. Slogans targeting the military high command and specifically the army chief of staff became common currency. Examples, generals to the trash bin and Algeria will be independent. Having aborted 2 presidential elections, the one in April in which Bouteflika was running for a 5th term, and the July 4th one, the popular movement unfortunately failed to hold the 12th December elections despite a huge boycott. However, on the same day of the elections, huge protests took place in various towns all over the country, and when the results were announced the next day, people went again to the streets to denounce the electoral charade. Where are we now? Due to the global health crisis, the Hirak decided to hold its weekly protests in mid-March 2020, after celebrating its first anniversary in February. But the amazing energy and dynamism created by this magnificent revolution has not disappeared. In fact, it metamorphosed into health campaigns and solidarity actions with the needy and most vulnerable in society during these difficult times. We have seen several initiatives of cleaning up and disinfecting public spaces, caravans of solidarity, campaigns to raise awareness about the disease, and other creative actions to keep the Hirak's flame alive. Meanwhile, the authoritarian and reactionary regime is doubling down on its repressive actions. Many activists are being judicially harassed, and several journalists have been jailed since the start of the lockdown. In total, dozens of Hirak activists are currently in jail. many of which were arrested for social media posts and were charged with threatening the integrity of national territory. The regime has not stopped at this. It continues tightening restrictions on online media by blocking access to several dissenting sites. The COVID-19 pandemic has in a way been a blessing to the ruling classes in Algeria. However, the popular movement has not said its last word yet. There is no doubt that the Hirak would resume after this pandemic subsides because the same conditions that gave rise to it are still present, if not exacerbated by the health crisis, as well as by the crumbling oil prices. In this context, evocative of the calm before the storms, Algerians will not dig their own graves by halting the revolution halfway. I will finish by mentioning this new research report published by the MENA Solidarity Network called Trade Unions and the Algerian Uprising, and you could have it online through the website of the MENA Solidarity Network. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hamza. That was fantastic. And I love a good PowerPoint. That's great visually to see everything that's going on in Algeria. Brilliant. We've still got 350 people watching, which is fantastic, but we want some more. So please make sure that you are sharing and sharing again. It's such a brilliant meeting. You don't want your people to miss out. So make sure you can spread this across as many people as possible. And please make sure that you are still sending through your comments and your questions. We really want to get to answer as many of those as possible. I will bring in our third and final speaker. She is Talat Ahmed, and she is the senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and she is also the author of Mahatma Gandhi Experiments in Civil Disobedience. So Talat, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and to the other two speakers. Yes, the impact of COVID across the global south really has been quite pronounced, and it's quite interesting that with so much focus on Europe and the fact that cases appear to be so few by comparison, people, or particularly the media, seem to want to ignore it in the West. I want to say something about India. As Mani said, the figures are much lower there in comparison to Britain. So, for example, there have been over 125,000 cases of COVID that have been identified, and the total number of deaths is under 4,000, it's about 3,700. But what's very interesting is that 25,000 cases have been identified in the last 4 days inside of India. And this is as a result of the slight measures of easing on the lockdown that were announced by the Modi government. And the fact that there has been this huge spike of 25,000 cases that have been identified, I think really is the beginnings of giving a clue to what a catastrophe COVID can really be when its full force is felt across the global south, and particularly in a country like India with 1.3 billion of a population. There are many aspects of coronavirus in India that I could talk about. I just want to mention two of them. Firstly, the plight of migrant labor, and secondly, the issue of Islamophobia. People have probably seen a few weeks ago when the lockdown was being announced in India back on the 23rd of March, that as a result of that lockdown, what you had was a scenario where literally in district after district, tens of thousands, in city after city, these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, growing to millions of people, of migrant laborers, who have lost everything. They have lost their jobs, they have lost their homes, they have lost their livelihoods. It's interesting that Mani was talking about the informal sector. Inside of India, the informal economy is set to comprise 92% of the total workforce. Right? 92% of it is informal. And this informal sector includes a whole slew of jobs. It includes people who are rickshaw drivers, who are taxi drivers, people who are porters and cleaners and sweepers inside hotels, inside airports, inside restaurants. It includes people in markets who are selling vegetables, vegetable stall holders, people who are, what's the phrase, shoeshine boys, for want of a better phrase, shoeshine men, and what have you. But it also includes people in the retail sector and contract labourers. And across India, the expansion that there has been in the economy, particularly in the last decade or so, has seen a massive growth of construction and construction sites all over huge cities. And of course, for that, it has been contract labour that has been brought in. And most of this labour, like a lot of the labour inside of Indian cities, is coming from small towns, but coming predominantly from tiny villages scattered all the way around India. And these people have lost absolutely everything. There's no such thing as furloughing inside of India. There is absolutely no protection whatsoever. There's no meaningful welfare state in any shape or form. There's no such thing as insurance or unemployment benefit or any of these kinds of measures that perhaps, and quite rightly, that in the West we take for granted and we would fight to defend. These kinds of things do not exist for people working in this sector in terms of migrant workers. Even the World Bank has estimated that in India there are 40 million migrant labourers. Now that is a conservative estimate, but even so, 40 million is a huge figure indeed. And because these people have lost everything, they have absolutely no choice but to try and get back to their villages, to at least be with their loved ones and to be with their families. But of course, because of the lockdown, all transport systems have been stopped. And so what we have seen is literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands migrant labourers trying to make their way on foot back to their own villages. And in some cases, this means people walking between 300 to 500, 600 kilometres back to their villages. If you are walking from Delhi, and a lot of the migrant labour is coming from the middle of India in terms of Madhya Pradesh, you're talking about 450 kilometres that people are walking, and they are prepared to walk because they have absolutely no choice whatsoever. And again, here we see another incapacity of the Indian state to actually deal with this, because there's no provision being made for these people. People might have read a couple of weeks ago, there's a tragedy that took place just in Maharashtra Strait, just outside of Mumbai, where a group of contract labourers who were trying to make their way home, they were so knackered that they just fell asleep on the railway tracks. And the reason they fell asleep on the railway tracks is because, of course, they understood that the trains were not operating. They were so tired, they just collapsed in a slumber. And they were mowed down by a train. Why was a train suddenly travelling on these railway tracks? Not because it was transporting people. No, it was because it was transporting goods. And 16 migrant labourers died in that accident, which is completely needless. But this also shines a very powerful light on other aspects of deep inequality inside of Indian society, because the trains are operating to move goods around, so business can operate, profits can continue to function, but trains are not able to operate in order to take migrant labourers back to their villages. Absolute indictment on the Indian state and its ability to deal with the mass of the population. And what we're witnessing is a humanitarian catastrophe here. The second issue is about Islamophobia. Now, inside of Indian society, we're familiar with Islamophobia in the West, but in Indian society, particularly in the last decade or so, the depth of anti-Muslim hatred and stereotyping and scapegoating is really got to an unprecedented level for anywhere in that part of the world. And of course, the whole issue of COVID has aligned itself to scapegoating. And so therefore we hear and we see screaming headlines in the press and on social media by leading commentators and politicians who talk about Muslims as being carriers of COVID. They're referred to as coronavirus jihadis. They're referred to as coronavirus terrorists, and that these people are threatening the very fabric of Indian society. And this kind of labeling of Muslims as being carriers of coronavirus has also been used to attack people, because of course we're now coming to the end of the month of Ramadan, and it's being used to attack Muslims who have been accused of gathering in groups, of assembling in large numbers in mosques and what have you, which isn't true at all. But nevertheless, this has been the kind of horrific levels of scapegoating that has been going on. I want to turn now, if I can, to say something about a level of resistance inside of India, because I think that this is really quite important. And in India, before COVID really hit and before the lockdown, you know, we can all be forgiven for thinking that that nothing's really that nothing was happening before the lockdown. But in India, there was a mass resistance campaign, and and it was really magnified by a magnificent protest that took place in Delhi at Shaheen Bagh, which is an area in southeastern Delhi. It is a Muslim area. Here you had a camp established by Muslim women. This camp lasted for 101 days. At its peak, it had over 100,000 people participating in a protest there. This marks the single largest campaign of civil disobedience that we have seen in India in decades. Why were these women protesting? They were protesting against Modi's introduction of a Citizenship Amendment Act. This is a piece of legislation which is going to fast track citizenship to refugees that come from neighboring countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It promises citizenship to everyone unless you're a Muslim. So if you're Hindu, if you're Parsi, if you're Sikh, if you're Christian, you will have citizenship, but not if you're a Muslim. And the BJP government has justified this on the basis that in Muslim majority countries such as Bangladesh or Afghanistan or Pakistan, you cannot be a refugee, you cannot be experiencing any persecution. If refugees were really the concern of the Modi government, then it's quite interesting that the Rohingya Muslims are not on that list to be given citizenship. It's interesting that Muslim minorities in Pakistan, such as the Ahmadiyya community or Shia Muslims, are not covered by this. And therefore, this is led quite rightly to the belief that this is a piece of legislation designed to stop Muslims from enjoying their rights and enjoying the rights of citizenship. The thing that's really awful, and this is the reason why the women in the camp decided to take action, because as Muslim women, they understand that this is going to affect their children, it's going to affect their families, and therefore the fear that this is really about stripping away the rights and citizenship of India's Muslim population. Now in India, there are 200 million Muslims, and they all feel under mortal threat as a result of what is going on. This camp was absolutely amazing. It was a lightning rod to other movements as well. And so there were student movements that took place. There were protests on a number of campuses, both inside of Delhi, but also outside of Delhi. And also there were workers that also came out to show solidarity. Just after Christmas, there was a general strike that took place, which involved 10 different trade unions that were participating in this. And I want to really end on coming back to this camp here of the women, because the other thing that we have to bear in mind is that the depth of Islamophobia inside of Indian society means that Muslim women have been subjected to being pilloried. They have been attacked for being backward, that they have no place in civil society, that they basically are at the beck and call of their men. And yet what we saw in this Shaheen Bagh camp was women at the forefront. They were in the vanguard of going there, setting up a camp, establishing it, and being on protest for 101 days. And the only thing that put that camp to an end was the lockdown. And obviously they've had to respect the lockdown. But I think what I will leave everybody with is the notion, is the belief and understanding that this resistance has not gone away. All the issues that blight India before COVID happened are still very much alive. And those issues, along with the way that COVID has been impacting upon India in this very deeply unequal way, will come back to haunt the Modi government.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Talat. That was brilliant. So fantastic to hear what's going on in India. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A portion of our meeting. I'm going to read out the first round of questions. We're going to have a second round of questions as well. So please feel free to keep on sending those in and keep on liking and sharing. So our first question comes from Kim, and she says, what are the chances of an internationally coordinated movement like the youth climate movement against governments putting profit before health during this pandemic? Our second question comes from Sally. Sally says, China are sending personal protective equipment to Africa. They seem to be putting themselves in a strong position to become a more dominant imperialist nation when this is over. What is the view of the rise of China from the global south? And question 3 comes from Richard, and he says, the economic crash has led to a collapse in the price of oil worldwide. Many poor countries like Algeria are dependent on oil exports for revenue. What is the effect of the oil crash on ordinary people in the global south? And what does this tell us about what transition to a sustainable world would look like? We've also got some comments. So we've got about 400 people watching, which is fantastic. Please make sure that you're continuing to liking and sharing this. Tara says, amazing to hear about Algeria, Hamza, so informative, a brilliant analysis, solidarity. Judy says, inspiring to hear how revolts can change those people who are revolting. And Frayleen says, brilliant to hear about the resistance in Indian Talat. So that's great. Just keep on interacting with us, keep on sharing your thoughts and your comments and sending those questions through. I'd like to start off with Hamza. If you can please take off on any of those questions, that would be brilliant.
Okay, thanks for these questions. I'll try to answer maybe one or two of them and leave the others for the other speakers. So I'll start with the oil crash. I didn't get the time to go into the details around the Algerian economy, but the Algerian economy is basically a rentier system that is based on extractivism, which is an economic model of accumulation and appropriation that makes the Algerian economy always dependent on international markets within that profoundly unjust international division of labor. So we export those cheap natural resources and we import all the rest, including our food. And the COVID-19 actually exacerbated the oil crash. The oil crash started weeks before when Russia and Saudi Arabia decided to increase production. So we saw the oil prices going like to very low prices, including sometimes with oil producers paying buyers in order for them to take the oil from their hands because they don't have storage capacity. The Algerian oil went down under $20, and that really affects the balance of the economy, given that the budget to be balanced needed around a price of the barrel at $50–60. So as I said in my presentations, the fundamental causes of the Algerian uprisings have been economic, due to neoliberal restructuring and also to the rentier nature of the economy. So basically, when the oil prices are high, the Algerian regime buys social peace by distributing petrodollars to society in free interest credits and loans, etc. But when the prices go down, then the problems start to erupt. And that happened in the 80s when the first Algerian uprisings in 88 took place. That was due to the oil crash of 86. That led to protests and economic discontent that led to the uprisings in 1988. And the same thing happened with the current uprising. So in the current context of COVID-19 and due to the lockdown, of course, Algerians are not taken to the streets, but the resistance is still there. And with oil prices that low, the Algerian regime does not have other solution. So they have either to intensify those austerity measures, which lead to more impoverishment, unemployment, and social discontent, or go to international financial institutions and get loans, which will have negative impacts on the Algerian economy. So this is around the oil question. Regarding the possibilities of building an international coordinated movement that put health or the public common before profits, I think, to be honest, I think this is the moment for that kind of stuff, because this COVID-19 crisis has shown the importance of public services and their universality. So I see it as an opportunity to build an international movement that put those public health services at the forefront, and limit the powers of the big pharmas. And actually, a lot of campaigns are taking place around those patents and trying to limit big pharma patenting drugs or vaccines that would ensure public health in the future.
Thank you for that, Hamza. That was great. I'm going to ask Gyekye if you can come in and let us know your thoughts on those questions.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the questions as well. I want to touch on the question about China, because it's true that as the people have said, both the private sector, people like Jack Ma, the philanthropist, like the Bill Gates of China, so to speak, people like Jack Ma and the Chinese government have been supplying, PPEs and so on and so forth. In the first place, I think that in itself speaks volumes about the nature of the system that we live in. Because if individuals like Jack Ma or Bill Gates or foreign governments can provide what 54 countries cannot do by way of masks or chemicals for testing or PPEs, it tells you the level of inequality and the irrationality of the system as a whole. And that's one thing that stands out very starkly. But the other thing too is that these things are distributed also not simply in a philanthropic way, but with a view to the alliances that are being built in places like Africa. Because one of the issues at play will be the geopolitical contestation and the geopolitical competition for African resources going forward. That's one of this predates the COVID, but I project that it will intensify. Some commentators, for example, have talked about the fact that what the COVID does, because of the scale of the economic crash that is beginning in Africa, what the COVID crisis exposes is that China's gamble, its huge gamble on Africa, is an utter disaster. That's what a lot of people are saying. This is the period in which the Americans have come out quite clearly. In the last month, Donald Trump's administration has come out quite clearly to raise, to offer billions and billions of dollars worth of funding for countries like Ethiopia, and it has done so explicitly by saying that it is doing so to displace China from the position that it enjoys in terms of its relationship with Ethiopia. This is the period that the Trump administration has launched what it calls a new free trade agreement with Kenya, a US-Kenya trade agreement, which again, recaptures all the dreams that the Singapore-on-Thames mad Brexiteers, neoliberal Brexiteers want to see in places like Britain, that being incubated and giving a new lease of life in places like Africa. So there's no doubt in my mind that there will be a scramble. Already, in terms of the oil crisis that Hamza talked about, the producer countries that do not have the best margins in terms of they're not the most cost-efficient producers, so to speak, will suffer. Okay, There are many oil operations that have collapsed, or any would-be oil projects in the pipeline that have come to a standstill. And those who have the deep pockets are going around buying up these licenses, these contracts, these deals at bargain bottom prices. And even beyond that, in terms of real assets within society. I mean, some of my old schoolmates who are now investment lawyers and so on will tell you that there's a lot of private Chinese money, for example, and private American money floating around, seeking to buy up land, real estate, factories, corner deals on drone delivery of medical supplies, pharmaceutical contracts, and so on and so forth. So the kind of process by which there's monopolistic interest in global supply chains and so on, I don't think is going to go away. The process by which that becomes intensified as a result of the intertwining of interests of multinational companies with their host governments, as I've described in the case of the Americans and the Chinese, is not going to go away, and so on. And people's view of China is ambivalent and is contradictory according to different circumstances and what plays out in different countries. By and large, there was a period when the boom in Chinese investment in Africa, the boom in Chinese trade, seemed to offer options for African governments and African policymakers, or sources of diversifying your export markets, or sources of raising investment capital, and so on and so forth. But that came on the back of the kind of neoliberal regime, the opening up of economy, the destruction of jobs, the deindustrialization, the collapse of agriculture, forced through by the likes of the World Bank and the IMF, the British government, and so on and so forth. And it is this opened up space that it was the period that allowed and frames the kind of role that China plays within Africa itself. So although the Chinese presence takes a different form, although the Chinese presence is also down to street level, I mean, you're not likely to find American or British corporate big bosses. You might see them in a club down the road, or a squash club, or whatever it is, or in a nightclub or whatever it is, but you're not likely to see them walking down the road backpack, sitting in the public buses, the matatus and so on. But you will see the Chinese doing that. You will see them selling cheek by jowl with traders in the market, for example. All kinds of things. So the sense, and you will see them more in the rural areas as well. So because the kind of Chinese interest is also one that is not simply about big capital. It's also one that is not simply about private capital. It's about the state. It's about small capital. It's about labor, and so on. So it is a lot more, if you like, many-sided. And it comes in a period when there's a great deal of flux in terms of economic relations in Africa, and so on. So people will have that ambivalent position. In the case of there has been xenophobia against, or xenophobia, if I don't know if that's the right word in English, somebody correct me, against Chinese people. But at the same time, you see the backlash that people face in terms of China and the treatment of Africans in China as well, which has been particularly horrible as well. So no racist response to racism. You cannot respond to racism, by being xenophobic yourself. I mean, and it brings back to the question of what others were saying about international movement and its necessity. I think that is hugely important, and it's absolutely vital. And maybe again, those are details that we should explore going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gyekye. I'm going to ask Talat to come in. I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are.
Okay, thank you. I'll begin with the question about China first. It's interesting what Manny was saying about the geopolitics of China's involvement in the global south, because we certainly see that in the region of South Asia. China is investing very deeply in Pakistan. It's involved in all kinds of projects there, massive infrastructure projects such as refuse collection, the whole thing about real estate. It is Chinese money that is literally buying land, building for luxury apartments, office suites, and what have you. Hotels are being built with Chinese money. So China is most definitely inside of the region of South Asia and in Pakistan. And this, of course, is producing and will continue to produce and contributes to further tensions between Pakistan and India in the region. Tensions between China and India have been there over many decades, going back to the 1950s, particularly after independence, over border issues to do with India and China and issues around Tibet. As a result, we have a history inside of Pakistan where various governments, both civilian and otherwise, have looked towards China in terms of providing some kind of support and leverage by having a bigger power than India on its side. And of course, with the growth of the Chinese economy and the way that China is really sort of, I suppose, pushing its weight in different parts of the global south and making connections, then we certainly see that inside of Pakistan. Most people in Pakistan, it has to be said, are quite in favour of this kind of investment, mainly because it is appearing to provide some services which they fear otherwise would not be provided. But obviously, it's very important, certainly to my mind, as someone who works on this region, I am very, very sensitive to how this is read in government circles inside of India, and also what this means in terms of the tensions between both India and Pakistan in terms of regional stability in that part of the world. The question of international solidarity, and I'll probably just end on this one really. Yes, the moment really is now. I mean, it's very interesting because I think the question also asked about climate change. Last spring in India, when it comes to Extinction Rebellion, there's a chapter of Extinction Rebellion that exists inside of India, and there were protests of people over climate change in India under the banner of Extinction Rebellion. So those kinds of movements, not only have we already seen them, but again, these movements have not gone away just because of COVID. The Shaheen Bagh women's protest that I mentioned earlier. It's very interesting. I was in India in January, and I was at a literature event. At that event, people were just outside of India, were just beginning to hear about this women's camp, and other international visitors who were at this event. It was very encouraging to hear speaker after speaker from platforms from different parts of Asia in particular, giving solidarity to the women at Shaheen Bagh, and also some of them actually went to visit the camp in Delhi as well. So certainly the time is very ripe right now for movements like this to be nurtured, to develop, and for us to make contacts, because one way or the other, whatever happens in the future with COVID, we need to have an international fighting movement of solidarity to deal with the after effects of COVID.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Talat. That was fantastic. I've got our next round of questions. So thank you everybody for sending those in. It's really great. So our first question comes from Irang, who says, Hamza, can you elaborate more on the civil movement from below under the COVID-19 situation? What are the responses of the organized working class response to the crisis? Are there examples that you can share of collective action by workers? Our second question comes from Bridget, who says, people are looking to a vaccine as the answer to COVID, but millions of people in Africa do not have access to current vaccines, e.g. for measles. How can we ensure that any vaccine, when it is discovered, is cheaply available worldwide? And our third and final question comes from Aisha. How can those in the global north build solidarity with the global south in the face of this crisis, but also more generally? So those are our three questions. Got some more comments from you viewers watching at home. Sally says, really insightful and informative speakers. Absolutely agree with you, Sally. And Paul says, the competition between US and China in Africa, very revealing, from Gyekye. So that was absolutely fantastic. I'm going to ask Talat to you to come back again on to those questions.
Okay, just the issue about vaccine access. I mean, yes, you obviously do want to see a vaccine develop. I suppose it's two things. One is that if a vaccine is discovered, then first of all, it's really important to make sure that that should be available to everybody freely across the globe. And we will have to fight for that, because it is not a given that it will be. And this really leads me to the second bit that's attached to this, which is, again, from previous experiences of a whole manner of bad things that have happened in the world. But we want to make sure that whatever kind of vaccines that there may be, that trial runs of them are not conducted on people in the global south first, because this has also been a systematic pattern of the way that pharmaceutical companies, the way that governments and medical advisors to them have a tendency to operate, whereby they think that if some kind of medical advance has been made, that what we have to do is to use the developing world as the guinea pig to trial run these kinds of things. That is definitely also a no-no. The global south is not the playground for big international medical foundations to think, and governments to think, that they can somehow experiment like this. We do want a lasting vaccine. That is what we are all hoping for. And we want to make sure it's something which is going to be completely safe and something which is completely secure and something that really is to the benefit of everyone across the world, and that it is something that should be available freely, and that no country should be charged for this. Just the question about building solidarity again. I mean, I think that, for us here in the West, it's a really great question. I think it's very important. I mean, this day and age, given that there's so much activity on Zoom and on social media, which has been incredibly valuable, this is also a way, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry about this, ignore my phone going in the background, that we are able to connect with people across the globe. And therefore also to find out what is happening in different parts of the planet, in terms of resistance movements, in terms of issues that are taking place, certainly in terms of India. On social media, there are still people who are having discussion posts about both Shaheen Bagh, but also about protest movements against the Modi government for its various policies. And this is something that, again, we in the West are able to contribute to. I think having forums like this are incredibly important as well, because it's something that allows voices from across the world to be brought into people's living rooms, so that people are able to share ideas, share experiences. And one of the things that I found very interesting about this panel is that listening to the other two speakers, and being British myself and knowing what the situation is here, is just how common some of the experiences are about COVID, and the injustices across the globe. So I think that's also something that we should bear in mind.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Talat. I definitely agree with you that forums like these are so important. I find this very, very interesting. It's been great so far. I'm going to call in Hamza. Hamza, could you come back on, I know that question was for you about Algeria. Could you come back on some of those?
Yes, I'll try in the little time that I have. So when the lockdown, when the COVID-19 pandemic, the news around it started circulating, the Algerian protesters were really suspicious of the authorities' call to stop all public gatherings. So in a way, they continued protesting after the first anniversary of the uprising that was on 22nd of February. And they were saying, in a way, better to have Corona than to have you. But then calls of wisdom prevailed, and the movement stopped its weekly protests on Friday and Tuesday. So the student movement was doing its protests on Tuesday. But then, as I said, that energy and that creativity did not disappear, especially in the midst of the inability of the regime to counteract the pandemic, especially that the health sector in Algeria has been hollowed by decades of neoliberal structuring and underfunding and attempts to privatize. So we've seen a lot of creative actions coming from the youth, from civil society. First, we've seen public awareness campaigns from the youth and from the students, raising awareness about the disease. We've seen campaigns of solidarity and caravans of solidarity, actually people going to the epicenter of the disease in Algeria, which was Blida, which is in the north center part of Algeria, going there and taking food and taking things to help the people that have been in in complete lockdown. We've seen also online social media campaigns to keep the flame of the uprising going and saying, we're gonna come back, especially in a context of intensifying repression. We've seen the Algerian authorities jailing and harassing a lot of journalists and activists, etc. When it comes to the workers and to the unions, I really encourage you to read the research report that I've talked about, released by the MENA Solidarity Center. And you can find it online, that we talked about the role of the trade unions during the Hirak. So there are a lot of complexities in there, because there is the pro-regime trade union, which is not at all serving the interests of the workers. And you have autonomous trade unions that have been in the Hirak since day one, organizing their own protests. But as you all know, with all trade unions, there are some contradictions within those. So I encourage you to read that report. Regarding the question around the solidarity between the global north and global south, I think Talat touched on a very important point, which is the necessity of free and universal availability of the drugs and the vaccines. And we need to really fight for that in order to disallow the profits of the big multinationals. Other ways that we can do is to support calls coming from the global south, and including the region I come from, North Africa and the Middle East. There are calls to cancel the debts and to cancel the free trade agreements, and we need definitely to support those, because continuing to pay debts at this time is just inhumane, because those resources need to go to safeguarding people's health, to helping them in these very difficult times. And also one last point is around solidarity, is to emphasize the voices of resistance, because people are not just passive victims. They resist against injustices, and we need always to bring those voices to the global stage and be in solidarity with them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hamza. Brilliant. I'm going to ask for Gyekye to come in and do our last final round of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and to Hamza and Talat as well. And I think that just to emphasize the question of the intellectual property regime around pharmaceutical companies and so on, it's particularly important, the point that Talat made about, parts of the global south and their populations being used as guinea pigs and so on. And also as the map around which monopolies are established within different markets. And it's not simply about the private companies and what we've seen them do. For example, Pfizer in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, around polio vaccinations, thousands of children damaged. Or some of you might remember John Le Carre's book, The Constant Gardener, about tests in Kenya and so on. Or you might have seen the two French scientists who were openly discussing a few weeks ago about, as casually as if, discussing the weather, about testing on Africans and so on. So those are real things. And it's not simply, as I said, about the private companies. The biggest US Department of Defense laboratories outside of the United States are in Africa, in places like Egypt and so on. And these are people who do tests on almost every simple pathogen, every virus, everything that is going, using a lot of bilateral exchanges to rope in local populations for their sample testing and so on, as well as give American companies a head start in terms of patents, in terms of pharmaceutical markets and so on. You see that happening again in the case of China, Chinese companies. You see that happening in Germany's tropical health institutes, and Britain, which has fallen back because of its own disinvestment in tropical health research, is trying to find a way back, to crawl back into this position. And sometimes it takes on, almost ludicrous proportions. When Donald Trump said that on the basis of, stories out of Wuhan, for example, that hydrochloroquine was part of the cocktail that was being used to treat patients in Wuhan and so on. And Donald Trump seized on that. I don't know where he got that information from, and says, it's a miracle drug. Many, many things happen. All of a sudden, the black market in hydrochloroquine manufacture in Africa boomed. And at the same time, there were complaints about the fact that the local pharmaceutical industries had been shattered precisely for the reasons that Hamza talked about, because of the international free trade agreements and so on. So you have two processes going on. On the one hand, a demand that the production capacities that empower society and give productive employment to people ought to be targeted at the health emergency that we face. That's perfectly correct. But to do so under conditions of private property and profiteering, as we can see, whether it's global or local, you have all manner of distortions. And it is in this sense that the resistance that people are talking about is particularly important. I did mention the frontline role that health workers have played the length and breadth of Africa. And sometimes it doesn't simply mean them standing on their own. In countries like South Africa, for example, you see broad coalitions beginning to emerge. Our comrades in Nigeria, for example, are deeply involved in a broad coalition involving health workers, involving community activists, and so on and so forth. And those are models, those are examples that everybody can learn from, and everybody can try to develop according to their circumstances. And again, the things that people have touched upon. Climate change, if you take East Africa, for example, a perfect storm. You have floods followed by droughts. I saw a picture of a riverbed in Kenya, northern Kenya, northwestern Kenya yesterday. Totally dry, as if it hasn't rained there for a decade. 4 days ago, that place was absolutely flooded. Now, this is a place which a week ago was being hit by locusts and so on. And then so you have this if you like, perfect storm. Locusts devastating agricultural produce in East Africa and all kinds of vegetation, flooding in the Lake Victoria area, across the region. You saw the cyclones in India and so on. There's a whole range of issues that are happening that animate all kinds of people who are committed to fight for change. And this is the moment to try and bring them together in increasing elements of united action. The climate activists, those who are about food security, those who are about jobs and livelihoods and so on. And again, I have to say, this is where socialists in particular have a particular responsibility and a unique contribution to make. Socialists have this kind of contribution to make precisely because of their understanding, first and foremost, about where all wealth in the world comes from. That every good, every service is produced by ordinary working people. And that those same ordinary working people, if they have the power and decision-making over that process, whether they are on furlough, whether they are at home in terms of stay in place, lockdown, whether they are out there working, to deliver essential services, they will take care of their needs collectively, because that's how always working people survive, and that's what they do. But at the same time, if they're not in charge of these resources, they're not in charge of the decision making, they are played off one against the other, and the divisions that we see can rapidly arise, like Talat was describing in the case of like Islamophobia in India. We see that in Africa all the time. I mentioned Malawi and the strikes that nurses have embarked on. But that strike wave was hit and reversed when an election was declared. When an election was declared, even the physical distancing went out of the window, because all the partisanship and the reach of the populists into the townships and so on and so forth meant that all kinds of things that could have happened and bring working people together began to unravel. The same situation in Burundi, where the entire World Health Organization office has been closed down and people have been expelled so that an election can be held. So I'm trying to say all kinds of divisions can take place, and when you have the kind of fluidity, the kind of wild, the kind of reserve armies of labor that have to scramble for survival, some people might find it difficult to see how this cross-class interest can be solidified. But socialists, this is our bread and butter. We start from that understanding, and that is why I referred at the beginning of the conversation to what socialists internationally have always done. Link the issues against racism, link the issues for women's liberation, link the issues against the different sectional or potentially divisive identities together as class questions. That's what we have to do in Africa. That's what we have to do internationally. When the World Trade Organization says we're going to develop new disciplines to ensure that medical supplies also become the subject of neoliberal rules, we know how to combat that. When people say climate change has to be postponed or livelihoods have to be sacrificed, we know how to combat that. But the critical factor I'm insisting on is class unity, putting the composite and comprehensive needs of the class first, internationally and locally, and doing so around an understanding of where the strategic flashpoints are, the strategic ways in which there's an overlap between community and workplace take place. My final point is to use an example in Ghana. A couple of weeks ago, we had one of the biggest multinational fishing companies in Africa. And anybody who wants to understand how the whole agro-food chain and its inequalities as well as its pathological effects. There's a recent article in the Financial Times about fishing in West Africa. I think it's a couple of weeks ago. Please go back and read it. It will give you a fair idea of where, whether it is, poultry and whether it is, pigs and African swine fever, or whether it is fishing, that whole natural resource agro-food chain is central, and I just want to refer people to that. Here in Ghana, just down the road in the industrial city next to Accra here, in Tema, which is also a port city, you've had one of the biggest fish processing factories. 533 workers declared, have been infected by the coronavirus. This is a company which was taken over by some multinational company in Thailand and so on and so forth. This is a company where socialists were key in building union, because it's a special economic zone or economic free zone factory. Socialists have been working there for decades, including colleagues of ours, comrades of ours, who built the union. They fought against flexibilization when the workforce was feminized, and on that basis, the union was weakened. There have been splits in the union. There are still splits in the unions today. These people were treated so badly. Many of them sent home, whether the overlap between communities and the workplace infection, the overlap between the supply chain, which involves fish markets and the factories, and so on. We don't actually even fully know. The point I'm trying to make is that if you have a constellation of struggle, of resistance, of consciousness, of network and organizing, that combines the spine of the factory with its strategic location, with its strategic power, with its structural and organizational features, with the market, with the communities and so on, you stand a better chance. You stand a better chance of engaging the unity that I'm talking about locally. You stand a better chance of extending that with a worldview around the fisheries and the global supply chain sector and so on. And this is where I think socialists in what we do is important. Combating of identity politics in its worst and sectional forms are positing at all times of the unity and the primary role of organized workers at the center of uniting people left, right, and center. From that point of view, I think internationally, those in the global north, you really have to step up a lot of what you're doing already. Talat did mention that discussions like this are primary, they're important. The role that organizations like Socialist Workers' Party and other left organizations play crucial and vital, and that must continue. And that must continue in the same way that is not simply about the different sections, but it's about uniting the struggles, the anti-racist struggles, the struggles against Islamophobia, the struggles against the stranglehold that companies have in terms of the privatization of the NHS, or whichever way it is. And I think those are the examples that we ought to share. Those are the inspirations that we ought to draw from each other. Those are the new lessons around which we can develop fresh ideas that can help ordinary people make good sense out of sometimes the misleading common sense that we are sold from the pulpits, from the preachers, from the imams, from the government, from the politicians, and so on and so forth. And I think the world now, really, there's everything to win, there's everything to lose. The stakes are very high, and socialists have a crucial role to play, as do all labor, working class activists, and all activists for social justice in the world. So solidarity necessary, as the comrades have said. Is it possible? Absolutely. And we have a special role in that. And that's where we should start from. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Solidarity indeed. I just want to say a massive thank you to all our speakers. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for taking your time to come and join us today. I'd like to say a thank you to all those watching at home for taking your time to come and watch these. Like Talat said, these meetings, these forums are so important. So it's great that you guys continue to watch on a weekly basis. Fantastic. I just have two short quick announcements to make. The first one, as we know it's trying times for businesses across the world, but especially independent small businesses. And we are asking that you continue to support a great bookshop, Bookmarks Bookshop, the Socialist Bookstore, an independent bookstore in these times. So it's we're in quarantine, we're at home, a lot of us have a little bit more time. And so if you can afford and you are thinking about expanding your knowledge in books and finding things to read, we're just asking if you make sure that you go to Bookmarks. They are running a very efficient service online, and order your books from there. It'd be absolutely fantastic and really greatly appreciated. So if you need some books, if you're looking to get some new materials to read, make sure that you're heading to Bookmarks. And the second thing, if you've enjoyed this meeting, if you've resonated with anything that's being said today, like Hamza said, we are not passive victims of what is going on. It's a trying time, but this is a really great time for resistance. It's a really good time for building our confidence and fighting against the ruling class. Things are happening every single day. People are angry, but we have a method, we have a direction, we have a source to put that anger to. And it's really important that we continue to build our communities and we continue to fight on. And I ask that you join the Socialist Workers' Party. This is just a small glimpse of the things that we do all across the world, as you can see. But it's really important that you come and join us in this fight. Movements are made out of people, and we need ordinary, fighting, working class people who are fed up of what's going on in the world to come and join us. So I really do ask you if you can click the link that's on the bottom of wherever you're watching, or just head to our Socialist Workers webpage. You'll find a joining form. That's it for me. I wish you all a lovely rest of your weekend. Thank you for joining us once again. Thank you to our speakers once again. Bye.